Democracy for Realists, Why Elections Do Not Produce Responsive Government, by Achen and Bartels. We're on Chapter 4, entitled A Rational God of Vengeance and of Reward, The Logic of Retrospective Accountability. Quote, "What is more dramatic than the spectacle we have seen repeated, and doubtless long shall see? The popular judgment taking the successful candidates on trial in the offices, standing off, as it were, and observing them and their doings for a while, and always giving, finally the fit, exactly due reward?" End quote. Walt Whitman, Democratic Vistas. Quote, "To support the ins when things are going well, to support the outs when they seem to be going badly, this, in spite of all that has been said about Tweedledum and Tweedledee, is the essence of popular government." End quote. Walter Lippmann, The Phantom Public. The developments in survey research, political psychology, and social choice theory, summarized in Chapter 2, severely undercut the intellectual foundations of the folk theory of democracy. 4th of July rhetoric notwithstanding, the hope that elections could ensure, quote, "the continued responsiveness of the government to the preferences of its citizens," end quote, dull, seemed to many students of democracy increasingly hollow in light of mounting evidence regarding voters' opinions and behavior. Absent some reliable mechanism for eliciting meaningful popular preferences and aggregating them into a coherent policy prescription, what, concretely, should a responsive democratic government actually do? No wonder, then, that when a less demanding version of democratic theory began to draw renewed attention in the 1960s, it was greeted with considerable enthusiasm, if not by political philosophers or ordinary citizens, at least by political scientists who spent their time studying public opinion, elections, and the policy-making process. The underlying idea was not new, but its explicit and detailed formulation as a defense of democracy brought it fresh respectability. The key insight of this alternative theory of democracy was that voters could exert substantial control over their leaders, despite knowing little about the details of public policy, simply by assessing the performance of incumbent officials, rewarding success and punishing failure. In one of the first and most influential formulations of this perspective, V.O. Key portrayed, quote, "the electorate in its great and perhaps principal role as an appraiser of past events, past performance, and past actions. It judges retrospectively. It commands prospectively only insofar as it expresses either approval or disapproval of that which has happened before." End quote. This retrospective theory of political accountability seems to provide a compelling way to think about the relationship between leaders and citizens in democratic political systems. Empirically, it accounts for fluctuations in the electoral fortunes of incumbent leaders and parties much more successfully than any spatial theory of issue voting. Moreover, it rescues political leaders from their fate as hapless automatons converging on the policy preferences of the median voter in the spatial theory, or perhaps more realistically as demagogues pretending to cater to the garbled voice of the people. In Key's words, quote, "the most acute ear attuned to the voice of the people can sense only the vaguest guidance for innovation to cope with the questions that must be met day by as an administration governs. The efficacy of self-government thus depends on party and governmental leadership with the initiative and imagination necessary to meet the public problems that develop and with the courage to assume the political risks involved." End quote. The retrospective theory gives political leadership its due, leaving initiative in the hands of elected officials to further voters' well-being by any feasible and legitimate means at their disposal. The normative appeal of the retrospective theory stems in no small part from the fact that it seems to save voters from the charge that they are too uninformed or too disengaged to play a meaningful role in the democratic process. For example, Morris Fiorina argued that retrospective voters, quote, need not know the precise economic or foreign policies of the incumbent administration in order to see or feel the results of those policies. In order to ascertain whether the incumbents have performed poorly or well, citizens need only calculate the changes in their own welfare. If jobs have been lost in a recession, something is wrong. If sons have died in foreign rice paddies, something is wrong. If drugs make neighborhoods unsafe, something is wrong. If polluters foul food, water, or air, something is wrong." End quote. By dispensing with the unrealistic notion that ordinary citizens vote on the basis of detailed preferences regarding every issue that might conceivably come before their future leaders, the theory of retrospective voting made the rather bleak portrait of poorly informed, habitual political behavior provided by the survey researchers of the 1950s and 1960s, if not quite irrelevant, at least not fatal. Voters need only monitor their own and their fellow citizens' day-to-day experiences and well-being. The seminal words of Key, Fiorina, and Gerald Kramer all portrayed retrospective voting as evidence of the fundamental rationality of American voters and elections. For example, Kramer characterized his analysis as demonstrating that election outcomes, quote, are not irrational or random or solely the product of past loyalties and habits or of campaign rhetoric and merchandising, end quote. Fiorina insisted that American democracy, quote, functions better than one would expect given behavioral political science's destruction of old illusions, and discerned rough justice, end quote, in the electoral punishment meted out to incumbent politicians by American voters in the elections of 1932, 52, 58, 68, and 74. And Key famously put the perverse and unorthodox argument of his book in a nutshell, quote, voters are not fools, end quote. As often happens, a coherent account of retrospective voting within the framework of rational choice theory came along only after considerable empirical evidence establishing the substantive importance of the phenomenon had already piled up. Nevertheless, the development of coherent accounts of why rational citizens might be expected to engage in retrospective voting and might benefit from doing so added considerably to the theory's normative appeal. In fact, two distinct accounts of that kind were produced. Much of the present chapter is devoted to summarizing them. While we attach great importance to the realism, empirical power, and normative appeal of the retrospective theory, we believe that its implications for democracy are less unambiguously positive than existing literature tends to suggest. In particular, the theory as it stands fails to do justice to the very considerable logic and informational difficulties faced by retrospective voters attempting to assess changes in their own welfare, as Fiorina put it, and to translate those assessments into meaningful evaluations of incumbent political leaders. Yeah. For one thing, it is by no means obvious that voters can ascertain whether the incumbents have performed poorly or well simply by calculating changes in their own welfare, as Fiona claimed. If jobs have been lost in a recession, something is wrong, but is that the president's fault? If it is not, then voting on the basis of economic conditions may be no more sensible than kicking the dog after a hard day at work. An even more fundamental problem is that voters may have great difficulty accurately assessing changes in their own welfare. Proponents of retrospective voting have routinely assumed that voters know when thugs make neighborhoods unsafe or polluters foul food, water, or air, as Fiorina put it. But that is by no means obvious. To the extent that voters' assessments of their own well-being are erroneous, retrospective voting will succeed much less well in selecting good leaders and in disciplining them to pursue voters' interests. We believe that these difficulties are more serious than previous scholars of retrospection have generally thought. As a result, we are left with a much more measured view of the extent to which retrospective voting justifies a portrait of citizens moving to considered decision as they play their solemn role of making and unmaking governments. The next section is called Evidence of Retrospective Voting. Politicians and political observers have long believed that voters punish failure and reward success, especially in the management of the economy. President James Buchanan blamed his party's dismal showing in the 1858 midterm election on economic distress resulting from the Panic of 1857. And no less a politician than Benjamin Disraeli recognized the electoral significance of bad harvests in 19th century Britain. In 1879, he went to a colleague that, quote, "The only danger and difficulty which the present ministry has to encounter are natural. After 4 bad harvests in this country, we are apparently about to meet a 5th dearth." End quote. Sure enough, in a disastrous election the following spring, the Tory government fell. The spatial model of party competition outlined in Chapter 2 provides no help in understanding politics of this sort. As Donald Stokes argued in his insightful critique of Anthony Downes's version of the spatial model, quote, "Throwing the rascals out is very different from choosing between 2 or more parties on the basis of their advocacy of alternatives of government action," end quote. Stokes insisted upon the electoral significance of, quote, "valence issues that merely involve the linking of the parties with some condition that is positively or negatively valued by electorate," end quote, in contrast to position issues of the sort represented in Downes's model. Quote, "In American presidential elections of the past generation, it is remarkable how many valence issues have held the center of the stage," end quote. From Depression and recovery in the 1930s and 1940s to the Korean War and corruption in 1952 to America's international prestige in 1960. Political scientists in the subsequent half-century have provided a great deal of more systematic evidence regarding the political significance of Stokes's valence issues. Key's evidence in The Responsible Electorate consisted primarily of statistical analyses of the correlates of vote switching from one presidential election to the next. For example, in each of Franklin Roosevelt's re-elections, poor people and blue-collar workers, the presumed beneficiaries of New Deal policies, were less likely than wealthy people and those in business and professional occupations to report having switched their votes from Democrats to Republicans. Moreover, people who reported supporting specific policies of the incumbent administration, compulsory old age insurance in 1936, the Wagner Labor Act in 1940, the Korean War in 1952, were less likely to defect than those who reported opposing those policies. And more important for Keyes' argument, people who approved of the incumbent president's performance were more likely to stand pat, even when the incumbent himself was not on the ballot, as in 1960. In retrospective voting in American national elections, Fiorina elaborated and extended Keyes' analyses in a variety of ways. He incorporated a wider variety of retrospective assessments, ranging from presidential performance to avoiding war to personal financial circumstances, and statistical analyses of vote choices in a dozen presidential and congressional elections. He used repeated interviews with the same survey respondents to document the impact of retrospective evaluations on shifts in partisan identification, and he examined the extent to which mediated retrospective evaluations, assessments of incumbent performance, were grounded in simple retrospective evaluations, assessments of economic and other conditions as good or bad, or improving or deteriorating, without reference to government, political parties, or the president. Scholars following in the footsteps of Key and Fiorina have generated a substantial body of research relating individuals' expressed retrospective judgments to their vote choices. Most of this work focused specifically on judgments of national economic conditions or personal economic circumstances or both, rather than on the broader variety of retrospective assessments examined by Key and Fiorina. Although most of the evidence comes from the United States, similar patterns of retrospective voting have been documented in many other countries. Virtually all of this work is subject to much the same methodological criticism we raised with respect to empirical studies of issue voting in Chapter 2. Observed cross-sectional relationships between retrospective evaluations, for example, assessments of incumbent performance or perceptions of the economy, and vote choices may reflect the electoral impact of retrospective evaluations, but they may also reflect the extent to which retrospective evaluations are constructed to rationalize vote intentions whose real causes lie elsewhere. Indeed, as Kramer pointed out in a single snapshot survey, real national economic conditions are a constant, so all of the observed variables or variation in perceived national economic conditions must reflect partisan bias, overgeneralization from personal experience or local conditions, and other vagaries of individual perception. As in the case of issue voting, it is possible to get some traction on this possibility by analyzing data from repeated surveys of the same individuals. Gabriel Lenz's analyses along these lines provided a striking contrast between the apparent causal impact of voters' policy preferences on one hand and their performance evaluations on the other. As we noted in Chapter 2, Lenz found surprisingly little evidence that policy preferences carried much weight in voters' judgments once he allowed for the reciprocal impact of vote intentions on policy preferences. However, his paralleled analyses of performance evaluations provided, quote, further evidence of the importance of performance-related issues such as the economy, although politicians, journalists, and scholars often interpret elections ideologically, end quote. Lenz concluded, quote, a growing body of evidence suggests that it is the economy and other performance domains, not ideology, that largely explain election outcomes. My results support this view, end quote. In the case of economic voting, the ready availability of objective economic data provides additional leverage for disentangling the causal relationship between retrospective assessments and vote choices. While economic perceptions and evaluations may be colored by politics, income, and the unemployment statistics have an independent reality that may or may not be manifested in voting behavior. Insofar as it is, the connection cannot simply be a matter of voters rationalizing choices unrelated to the actual condition of the economy. Thus, systematic analyses of the aggregate level relationship between economic conditions and election outcomes may complement and bolster analyses showing that individual voters' economic perceptions shape their electoral behavior. Harold Gosnell and various co-authors produced a series of remarkably sophisticated and politically acute studies of the relationship between economic conditions and election outcomes in the New Deal era. Gosnell and keeps giving references, the same guy. Using impressive variety of economic and political data from Chicago, Iowa, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, and statistical tools that would not come into general use in the social sciences until a quarter century later, they demonstrated that voters' recent economic circumstances did indeed appear to influence election outcomes. The line of research advanced by Gosnell made little further progress over the next few decades as scholars of electoral politics turned their attention to the exciting new possibilities for detailed individual-level analysis offered by the advent of scientific opinion surveys. However, the study of economics and elections was reinvigorated by the publication of Kramer's 1971 article on short-term fluctuations in U.S. voting behavior, 1896 to 1694. Whereas Gosnell and his colleagues had focused on single states or localities over relatively short periods of time, Kramer analyzed the relationship between national economic conditions and the national congressional vote across 34 biennial elections. He examined the electoral relevance of a variety of economic indicators, including real income, unemployment, and inflation, as well as the effects of congressional incumbency and presidential coattails. He concluded that economic fluctuations, most notably election year changes in real per capita income, quote, are important influences on congressional elections, accounting for something like half the variance of the congressional vote over the period considered, end quote. Scores of scholars following in Kramer's wake have examined the impact of economic conditions on election outcomes in the United States and elsewhere. While various aspects of the relationship, including the magnitude and timing of electoral responses to specific economic conditions, the psychology linking economic conditions to voters' choices and the implications of institutional and contextual variation are far from settled, a virtual consensus has emerged that the electoral impact of economic conditions is real and substantial. The next section is called Retrospective Voting as a Mechanism for Selecting Competent Leaders. The most straightforward way to interpret retrospective voting is as an attempt by voters to select the best available team of political leaders. In this view, there are consequential differences among the competing parties in any given election, differences in motivation, competence, ideology, or some combination of these and other factors. These differences imply differences in future personal or collective well-being, at least in expectation. The voter's problem is to forecast future well-being under each of the competing parties and choose the one offering the most favorable prospects. This interpretation of retrospective voting portrays voters as rational and forward-looking, but their prospective choices are rendered retrospective through the auxiliary assumption that parties' past performance in office can generate rational expectations about future performance. In the influential formulation of Anthony Downs, quote, rational behavior is impossible without at least some way of forecasting future events. Since one of the competing parties is already in power, its performance in period T gives the best possible idea of what it will do in the future, assuming its policies have some continuity, end quote. While the basic logic of retrospective selection is straightforward, the precise implications for voting behavior depend on the nature of the presumed relationship between past performance and future prospects. Assuming for the sake of argument that the voter's well-being under the incumbent party in the most recent period provides the best possible idea of its future performance, how informative is that? And how informative is earlier experience with the incumbents or with the out party? Does the diagnostic value of past experience vary with turnover in personnel or changes in social conditions? The appendix to this book sets out a simple mathematical model of retrospective selection, providing a framework for addressing questions of this sort. The model assumes that a representative voter's electorally relevant subjective well-being under the incumbent is determined by a simple combination of the incumbent's intrinsic competence and the random factors outside the incumbent's control, good or bad luck. The problem from the voter's perspective is to infer as much as possible about the incumbent's intrinsic competence and thus about her likely performance in the next period if she is re-elected. If the incumbent's intrinsic competence does not vary over time or varies purely randomly with no correlation across time periods, the best available estimate of her competence is simply the average well-being experienced under her leadership in the current and previous periods. An important implication of this fact is that a rational voter's assessment of the incumbent's competence will take into account performance in every relevant period, not just in the current period. In Fiorina's felicitous phrase, the rational voter maintains a running tally of subjective well-being under the incumbent, updating it continually on the basis of good or bad experience. Thus, retrospection provides a basis not only for vote choices in a given election, but also for more or less durable partisan preferences, what Fiorina called a political theory of party identification. If we relax the assumption that the incumbent's competence is constant over time, then our voter should, from his forecast of the incumbent's future competence, somewhat differently, depending on exactly how competence is supposed to evolve. Let me reread that. If we relax the assumption that the incumbent's competence is constant over time, then our voter should form his forecast of the incumbent's future competence somewhat differently, depending upon how competence is supposed to evolve over time. In general, however, the possibility of changes in competence makes previous experience less relevant, leading voters to attach relatively more weight to more recent experience. The efficacy of the voters' efforts to select a competent incumbent in this framework obviously depends on the quantity and quality of evidence provided by prior experience. If the continuity of party leadership is minimal, a party's past performance may have little bearing on how well it will perform in the future. If voters' subjective well-being is determined more by extraneous events such as droughts or oil price shocks than by the quality of the incumbent's policies and management, electoral rewards and punishments may often be misdirected. However, to the extent that voters' past political experience does shed light on the likely quality of future leadership, they can and should weigh that experience when they go to the polls. The next section, retrospective voting as a mechanism for sanctioning leaders. The logic of retrospective voting as a mechanism for selecting competent leaders is fairly straightforward. However, it may be more surprising that retrospective voting can promote voters' well-being even when there are no difference in competence among political leaders. As long as incumbents or their parties desire re-election, the knowledge that voters at the next election will reward them for success or punish them for failure provides incentives for leaders to maximize voters' well-being as best they can. As Fiorina put it, quote, "Given political actors who fervently desire to retain their positions and who carefully anticipate public reaction to their records as a means to that end, a retrospective voting electorate will enforce electorate accountability, albeit in an ex post, not an ex ante sense." To explicate this logic, the appendix sets out a second model of retrospective voting in which variation in incumbent competence plays no role. Incumbents and challengers are assumed to be identical. The issue of political accountability is simply a matter of moral hazard of the sort familiar from economic models of principal-agent relationships. The current incumbent may be tempted to focus on other goals besides maximizing voters' subjective welfare, and voters cannot directly monitor how diligently the incumbent is working on their behalf. However, they can tell when they experience pain or pleasure, and they know that their pain or pleasure is attributable, in part, to the incumbent's efforts. In contrast to the retrospective selection model, the sanctioning model assumes that each voter's electorally relevant subjective well-being depends solely on the amount of effort expended by the incumbent leader on the voter's behalf, and on the net effect of random forces beyond the incumbent's control. Luck plays much the same role in this model as in our model of selection on the basis of incumbent competence, representing the impact of the voter's well-being of factors unrelated to the incumbent's effort. However, we assume that the voter cannot directly observe the incumbent's expenditure of effort or distinguish the effects of effort and luck. Thus, his decision whether or not to return the incumbent leader to office for the next period is governed by the sum of both factors. In this second model, the incumbent knows that her probability of re-election depends in part on how much effort she exerts on the voter's behalf. However, she also knows that her fate depends in part on good or bad luck. Moreover, since effort devoted to increasing the voter's subjective well-being is presumed to be costly, it may require foregoing graft, ideological goals, or the esteem of future historians. Incumbents weigh the opportunity cost of exerting effort on the voter's behalf against the potential benefit of re-election. For their part, voters cannot directly control or even observe the incumbent's exertion of effort. However, they can decide whether or not to re-elect the incumbent based on good or bad outcomes, attributable in part to the incumbent's level of effort. They want to choose a standard for re-election that will elicit as much effort as possible from incumbents. Intuitively, one might think that they should set the standard as high as possible, since their expected well-being is always higher when incumbents exert more effort on their behalf. However, setting the standard too high actually discourages effort. If incumbents know that they are unlikely to get re-elected whatever they do, they are more likely to shirk. Indeed, in equilibrium, it turns out that voters should always set the standard for re-election so that the incumbent's ex-ante probability of re-election will be 0.5, regardless of whether that standard turns out to induce incumbents to exert a little or a lot of effort on their behalf. Thus, an interesting application of the model is that we should expect incumbents to be re-elected half the time. Nevertheless, the voters' expected well-being is greater when their assessment of the incumbent's performance depends less on luck and more on incumbent effort, since in that case the incumbent can expect a closer correspondence between exertion and reward in the form of re-election. In that respect, the primary implication of the model focusing on variation in incumbent effort parallels that of the model focusing on variation in incumbent competence. Retrospective voting can be a powerful mechanism for electoral accountability, but only insofar as voters can discern and set aside irrelevant factors contributing to their subjective well-being. And that is where I'm going to stop. The next section is called Challenges to the Effectiveness of Retrospective Accountability. Have a good day.